I arrived at the Tethys station on a Tuesday morning that felt like the middle of the night. The support vessel had left Port Angeles at 4 in the morning, and by the time we reached the drop coordinates, the sun was a pale disk behind the marine layer. I'd signed my contract 3 weeks earlier, forwarded my certifications, and received a single-page PDF titled Operational Protocols, Mandatory Compliance. I'd skimmed it. I needed the money. My student loans had compounded past $60,000. The tenure-track position at Oregon State had evaporated when the grant funding dried up. Tethys paid $72,000 for a 6-month rotation, plus hazard differential. The recruiter had been clear. No surface leave, no visitors, no exceptions. I'd asked about internet. She'd said the station had email access during scheduled communication windows. I'd asked about the research focus. She'd said benthic ecology and extremophile documentation. I'd asked about the crew size. She'd said 8 maximum, usually 6. The descent took 41 minutes. I sat in the personnel sphere with my duffel and a plastic crate of books. The support tech, a woman named Carla, checked my harness twice and explained the procedure. The crane would lower me to 30 meters, then the station's external winch would take over. I would feel a bump during the handoff. I should not unbuckle until the green pressure light activated. She gave me a radio headset and told me to keep it on. The water went from gray-green to dark blue to black. I watched the depth gauge. 15 meters, 20, 25. The sphere jerked at 30 meters. I heard the winch cable release and then the heavier pull of the station's retrieval system. Carla's voice crackled in the headset. "Handoff complete. Station winch active. You're about 8 minutes out," I said. "Understood." The descent continued. I couldn't see anything beyond the sphere's small porthole except the occasional flash of bioluminescence. The depth gauge climbed. 50 meters, 75, 100. At 112 meters, the winch slowed. I felt the sphere rotate slightly, and then I saw lights. The station emerged below me, a central hub with 4 radial modules extending like the arms of a cross. The exterior lights were sodium yellow and made the water look like old film stock. The sphere docked with a metallic clang. I waited. The pressure light stayed red for 2 minutes, then blinked amber, then went solid green. I unbuckled and opened the hatch. A man in a gray jumpsuit stood on the other side. He was maybe 50, with a shaved head and wireframe glasses. He said, "Dr. Marsh?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I'm Petrov, station lead. Welcome to Tethys." He helped me with my gear and led me through a short corridor into the central hub. The hub was a circular room about 8 meters across with 5 hatches. 1 for the docking module, 4 for the radial arms. The ceiling was low, maybe 2.1 meters. Everything was white or gray. There was a long table with bench seating and a kitchenette along one wall. A woman sat at the table with a laptop. She glanced up, nodded, and went back to her screen. Petrov pointed to the hatches in sequence. North module, sleeping quarters and showers. East, Lab 1 and dry storage. South, Lab 2 and equipment lockers. West, observation and moon pool. You'll bunk in North 3. The codes rotate daily. "I'll show you the system," I said. "Where's everyone else?" He said, "Conrad and Yates are in the observation module. Dr. Shen is running a culture sequence in Lab 2. You'll meet them at the briefing." He led me through the north hatch. The corridor was narrow and lit by recessed LEDs. There were 4 doors, each with a keypad and a small label. North 1, North 2, North 3, North 4. He stopped at North 3. He said, "Your code is 5728. It changes at 0600 each morning. New codes post on the hub board at 0545. Memorize them. Don't write them down." I said, "Why not?" He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Station policy." The room was 3 meters by 2.5. A bunk, a desk, a narrow locker, a porthole. The porthole showed only black water and the faint glow of the station's exterior lights. I dropped my duffel on the bunk. Petrov said, "Briefing is at 1800. Don't be late." I unpacked. I had 3 changes of clothes, a toiletry kit, the books, a laptop, and a waterproof notebook. I put the clothes in the locker and the books on the desk. I checked my watch. It was 14:20. I had 3 hours and 40 minutes. I explored the station. The hub was quiet. The woman with the laptop was gone. I walked through the east corridor and found Lab 1. Benches, microscopes, centrifuges, refrigeration units, a fume hood. The air smelled like ethanol and salt water. I continued to dry storage. Shelves of sample jars, chemical containers, equipment, cases. Everything was labeled and inventoried. I went back to the hub and tried the south corridor. Lab 2 was larger, with an autoclave, incubators, and a long glove box. I heard voices and kept walking. The equipment lockers were at the end. Racks of dive gear, tool kits, sealed bins marked with hazard tape. The west corridor led to the observation module. I opened the hatch and stepped into a circular room with a domed ceiling. 3 large portholes faced outward, each a meter in diameter. 2 people stood at the center porthole. A young man in a blue jumpsuit and an older woman with short gray hair. The woman turned. She said, "You're Marsh." I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm Yates. This is Conrad. We're on observation rotation until 2000. Conrad nodded but didn't speak. He was staring out the porthole. I walked closer and looked. The water beyond was black. The station's exterior lights illuminated maybe 15 meters. Then nothing. I could see the curved edge of the seafloor, silt and rock, and something that might have been coral. Yates said, "We're at 112 meters. Seafloor slopes down to 140 on the south side. The lights don't reach it." I said, "What are you observing?" She said, "Patterns, movement, thermal signatures. You'll learn the protocols." I asked what kind of patterns. She pointed to a monitor mounted on the wall. The screen showed a grid with depth markers and coordinates. There were several clusters of small red dots. She said, "Benthic fauna, mostly crustaceans and cephalopods. Sometimes larger animals pass through. We log everything," Conrad said. "Something's at the south porthole." Yates and I both turned. The south porthole showed the same black water and silt. "I didn't see anything," Conrad said. "Lower left, 2 o'clock relative to the porthole frame." I looked again. There was a faint shape, maybe a shadow or a trick of the light. It moved slowly, then stopped. I couldn't make out any details. Yates checked her watch. She said, "Log it. Distance approximately 20 meters. Movement lateral. Duration 12 seconds. Conrad typed something into a tablet. He said, "Logged." The shape was gone. I stared at the empty water for another 30 seconds, then went back to the hub. At 17:55, I returned to the hub. The table was occupied. Petrov sat at the head. Yates and Conrad were across from each other. A thin man with dark hair sat next to Conrad. A woman in her 30s sat at the far end. Petrov gestured to an empty seat. He said, "Dr. Marsh, this is Dr. Shen and this is Torres. Torres handles maintenance and systems." Torres nodded. Shen didn't look up from her notebook. Petrov opened a binder and removed a laminated card. He slid it across the table to me. The card was covered in dense text, numbered 1 through 14. He said, "These are the core operational protocols. Read them now. You'll receive a copy for your quarters, but you need to understand them before your first shift." I read the card. Tethys Station Operational Protocols 1. All exterior hatches must remain sealed between 2200 and 0600. This includes the moon pool access, wet room, and docking module. No exceptions. 2. Observation module occupancy is limited to 2 personnel at any time. If you enter and find 2 people already present, leave immediately and wait in the hub. 3. Do not respond to any voice or knock at your quarters door between 0100 and 0400. Verify identity through the door monitor before opening at any other time. 4. If you see another crew member in a corridor without their name badge, do not acknowledge them. Return to the hub and report to the station lead. 5. All exterior lights must be turned off between 0214 and 0226 each night. The timer is automatic. Do not override it. 6. Communication with the surface is restricted to scheduled windows. 0800, 1300, and 1900. Emergency frequency is channel 9. Use only in documented emergencies. To 7. The moon pool is off limits, except during scheduled dive operations. If you hear water movement from the moon pool outside of dive operations, do not investigate. Report to the station lead. 8. Do not enter Lab 2 if the red pressure light above the door is active, even if you hear someone inside. 9. Inventory checks occur at 0700 and 2100 daily. Count all oxygen canisters, battery packs, and emergency rations. Record discrepancies immediately. 10. If the external hull pressure alarm sounds, proceed to your designated safe room and seal the hatch. Do not exit until the all clear is given by the station lead or by surface command via radio. 11. The west corridor porthole must remain covered with the steel shutter between 2300 and 0500. Do not open the shutter during this period for any reason. 12. Do not consume any food or water stored in the south module equipment lockers. These supplies are reserved for emergency use only and are sealed for contamination control. 13. If you see lights moving outside the station that are not part of the exterior lighting array, do not attempt to identify the source. Record the time and location, then move to the hub. 14. All research materials and samples must be logged in the central database within 1 hour of collection. Do not store biological samples in personal quarters. I read the list twice, then I looked up. I said, "What happens if someone breaks these protocols?" Petrov said, "Don't break them," Yates said. "The previous crew had an incident. We lost 2 people. These protocols are why the rest of us survived." I said, "What kind of incident?" Petrov said, "The report is classified. The protocols are not. Follow them." He took the card back and handed me a second card, identical to the first. He said, "Keep this in your quarters. The protocols are also posted in the hub and in each lab. If you're uncertain about a procedure, ask. If you can't ask, default to the safest option," Torres said. "The safe option is usually to lock yourself in your room and wait." Shen looked up from her notebook. She said, "Has anyone explained the observation schedule?" Petrov said, "I will. But first, Dr. Marsh needs to understand the shift structure." He walked to the hub board and pointed to a printed schedule. There were 6 names listed in rotating blocks: Petrov, Yates, Conrad, Shen, Torres, Marsh. Each block was color-coded: green for day shift, blue for observation, yellow for maintenance, red for rest. Petrov said, "Day shift is 0600 to 1400. You'll work in the labs, process samples, run analyses. Observation shift is 1400 to 2200, 2 people at a time in the observation module. Maintenance is 2200 to 0600. 1 person stays awake to monitor systems. The rest are on rest rotation." I said, "What about the night shift? Who's watching the station between 0100 and 0400? Torres said, "No one. That's the protocol." I looked at Petrov. He said, "Between 0100 and 0400, all personnel remain in their quarters with doors sealed. The automated systems handle monitoring. If there's a critical failure, the alarms will wake us." I said, "That seems like a gap," Yates said. "It's not a gap. It's intentional," Conrad said. "You'll understand after your first week." The briefing continued for another 40 minutes. Petrov explained the communication: Windows, the inventory system, the emergency procedures. He showed me the location of the life raft capsules, the backup oxygen tanks, the manual override for the ballast system. He explained that if we needed to evacuate, the station could ascend to 30 meters in approximately 18 minutes, but the process would destroy most of the interior systems due to rapid decompression. He said, "Evacuation is a last resort. We've never used it. Don't plan on using it." At 19:30, the briefing ended. Shen and Torres left for the labs. Conrad and Yates returned to the observation module. Petrov told me to get rest. My first shift would start at 0600 the next morning. I went to my quarters and locked the door. I sat on the bunk and read the protocol card again. I tried to make sense of it. Some rules seemed reasonable: the exterior hatch restriction, the observation limit, the emergency procedures. Others felt arbitrary or paranoid. the lights out window, the voice, restriction, the moon pool monitoring. I opened my laptop and checked for internet. There was none. I checked for a local network. I found the station's database system but couldn't log in without credentials. I closed the laptop and looked out the porthole. The water was completely black now. The exterior lights had dimmed to a faint orange glow. I checked my watch. It was 21:43. I had 19 minutes before the inventory check. At 21:57, I heard footsteps in the corridor. Someone knocked on my door. I looked at the door monitor. It showed Torres standing outside. He was wearing his maintenance jumpsuit and holding a tablet. I opened the door. He said, "Inventory. You need to observe the first one so you know the procedure." I followed him to the hub. Petrov was already there with a clipboard. Torres opened a panel on the wall and removed a keyring with 12 keys. He unlocked the south module hatch and we walked to the equipment lockers. Torres said, "We count 3 categories: oxygen canisters, battery packs, emergency rations. The counts are fixed. Oxygen should be 24, batteries should be 36. Rations should be 48 individual packs." We counted. Oxygen, 24, batteries, 36, rations, 48. Torres logged the counts on his tablet. He said, "If the count is off, you report it immediately. Don't try to investigate, just report." I said, "What if something's been used?" He said, "Nothing gets used without documentation. If the count is wrong, it means something else happened." We returned to the hub. Petrov took the key ring and locked it back in the wall panel. He said, "Next inventory is 0700. You're on it with Conrad." I went back to my quarters. It was 22:18. I brushed my teeth in the small sink, changed into sleep clothes, and lay on the bunk. The station made sounds, the hum of ventilation, the occasional creak of metal adjusting to pressure, a distant, rhythmic pulse that might have been the water circulation system. I closed my eyes. At 01:14, I woke to knocking. 3 steady knocks on my door, evenly spaced. I checked my watch. Then I remembered Protocol 3. Do not respond to any voice or knock between 0100 and 0400. I stayed in the bunk. The knocking stopped. I waited. 30 seconds passed. Then I heard a voice outside my door. It was Petrov's voice. He said, "Dr. Marsh, I need you to open the door. There's a pressure issue in the north module." I didn't move. I stared at the door monitor. The screen was black. No image. The voice said, "Dr. Marsh, this is station lead. Open the door." I checked my watch again. 01:15. I stayed silent. The voice said, "I can hear you breathing. Open the door now." I pulled the blanket over my head and pressed my hands against my ears. I counted to 100. When I stopped counting, the corridor was silent. I checked the monitor. Still black. I stayed in the bunk until my watch read 04:03. Then I got up and looked through the porthole. The water was the same as before, black and still. At 05:47, I checked the hub board for the new door codes. My new code was 2915. I memorized it and went back to my quarters to change into my work jumpsuit. At 0600, I met Conrad in the hub for inventory. We walked to the south module in silence. Conrad unlocked the equipment lockers. We counted. Oxygen 24, batteries 36, rations 48. He logged the results. I said, "Did you hear anything last night?" He said, "Like what?" I said, "Knocking. Voices." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Did you open your door?" I said, "No." He said, "Good, don't." We returned to the hub. Yates and Shen were preparing breakfast. Instant coffee, freeze-dried eggs, protein bars. I ate quickly and reported to Lab 1. My first task was to process sediment samples from the previous week's collection. The work was straightforward: microscopy, documentation, data entry. I finished by 1100 and moved to Lab 2 to assist Shen with a bacterial culture sequence. At 1300, the communication window opened. Petrov used the radio in the hub to contact Surface Command. I could hear the conversation from Lab 2. Petrov said, "Tethys station to surface. Daily check-in. All systems nominal. Crew count 6. No incidents to report. A woman's voice responded. Surface to Tethys. Acknowledged. Weather advisory. Storm system moving through your region starting 2200 tonight. Expect heavy surface chop. Deep current should remain stable. Next check-in at 1900, Petrov said. Understood. Tethys out. At 1400, I began my first observation shift. Yates met me in the observation module. She showed me the monitoring system. 3 screens showing different camera angles, a sonar display, a thermal overlay. She explained the logging procedure. Any movement beyond 30 meters had to be recorded with time, direction, estimated size, and duration. She said, most of what you'll see is normal. Crabs, octopuses, occasional fish, sometimes a shark or a ray. You log everything anyway, I said. What about the things that aren't normal? She said, you'll know when you see them. Log those especially carefully. At 1522, I saw movement at the north porthole. Something large and pale, moving slowly from left to right. I couldn't see details, just a shape approximately 2 meters long. It moved for 8 seconds, then disappeared into the darkness. I logged it. 1522, north porthole, large pale shape, 2 meters estimated, lateral movement, 8 seconds duration. Yates checked my entry. She said, good. Did you see any appendages? I said, no. She said, note that too, limb count unknown. I updated the log. At 1609, the shape returned. This time it was closer, maybe 12 meters from the porthole. I could see texture, smooth, not scaled, no obvious head or tail. It moved in the same direction as before, left to right, and took longer to pass out of view. 14 seconds. I logged it. Yates watched the thermal display. She said, no heat signature. That's unusual. I said, could it be a whale? She said, not at this depth, not without a signature, and not moving like that. At 1641, I saw it again, this time at the center porthole. It was closer still, maybe 8 meters away. I could see more detail. The surface was completely smooth, almost reflective. There was a dark stripe or seam running along what might have been its side. It moved upward this time, slowly, and I realized it was ascending toward the station's exterior lights. I logged it. Yates stood and walked to the porthole. She stared at the shape until it disappeared above the station. She said, it's circling us. I said, should we report it? She said, we are reporting it. We're logging it. That's the protocol. At 1700, Conrad arrived to relieve Yates. She briefed him on the sightings and left. Conrad sat at the monitoring station and didn't speak. I watched the portholes. At 1739, the shape appeared again, this time at the south porthole. It was descending now, moving back toward the seafloor. It took 19 seconds to pass from view. I logged it. Conrad said, it's hunting. I said, what makes you think that? He said, the pattern. Circling, ascending, descending. It's looking for a way in, I said. It's a station. There's no way in from outside, he said. Not for us. At 1826, the shape passed the west porthole. I couldn't see it, but the thermal display showed a cold void where something should have been. Conrad logged it. He said, 6 sightings in 3 hours. That's more than usual. I said, this happens regularly. He said, not regularly, but it happens. At 1900, Petrov's voice came over the intercom. All personnel to hub for communication window. Conrad and I went to the hub. Everyone was there except Torres, who was in the south module running a systems diagnostic. Petrov used the radio. He said, Tethys station to surface. Evening check-in. All systems nominal. Crew count 6. No incidents to report. The woman's voice said, surface to Tethys. Storm system is ahead of schedule. Winds currently 40 knots and increasing. Expect communication disruption starting 2300. Next scheduled window is 0800, but we may not have clear signal. Monitor channel 9 for emergency updates. Petrov said, understood. Tethys out. He turned off the radio. He said, storm means possible power fluctuations. Torres will monitor the backup systems tonight. Everyone else, standard protocol. Stay in your quarters between 0100 and 0400. Shen said, "Are we expecting any anomalies?" Petrov said, "We're always expecting anomalies. That's why we have protocols." At 2100, I assisted with the evening inventory. The counts were correct. Oxygen 24, batteries 36, rations 48. I returned to my quarters at 2136. I ate a protein bar, read 50 pages of a novel about Arctic exploration, and set an alarm for 0530. At 0214, the lights went out. I woke in complete darkness. I checked my watch. The display glowed faintly. 0214, Protocol 5. All exterior lights must be turned off between 0214 and 0226 each night. I lay still and listened. The station sounds were different without the lights. The ventilation seemed louder. I heard something else too, a low, rhythmic sound, like slow breathing or water moving through a pipe. I couldn't identify the direction. At 0226, the lights came back on. The rhythmic sound stopped. I checked the porthole. The exterior lights were back to their normal orange glow. The water looked the same as always. I didn't sleep well after that. At 0600, I went to the hub. Conrad was already there. We did the inventory together. Oxygen 24, batteries 36, rations 47. I said, 47, Conrad recounted. He said, 47. We checked the log. Yesterday's evening count was 48. We returned to the hub and reported to Petrov. He was drinking coffee at the table. I said, morning inventory shows one missing ration pack. Petrov set down his coffee. He said, "You're certain?" Conrad said, "We counted twice." Petrov stood and walked with us to the south module. He counted the rations himself. 47. He checked the locker seal. It was intact. He checked the log tablet. The last documented removal was 6 days ago, when Torres had replaced an expired pack. Petrov said, "Protocol 9. Record the discrepancy. Continue with normal duties. I'll investigate." At 0741, Petrov called a meeting in the hub. Everyone except Torres was present. Torres was sleeping after his overnight maintenance shift. Petrov said, "This morning's inventory showed one missing ration pack. The locker seal was intact. No one has documented removing supplies. I need to know if anyone took a pack for personal use." No one spoke. Petrov said, "This isn't a discipline issue. I need to know if the discrepancy is human error or something else." Yates said, "No one took it." Shen said, "I haven't been in that locker in 3 weeks." Conrad said, "I only access it during inventory." Petrov looked at me. I said, "I've only been here 2 days. I haven't taken anything." Petrov said, "Then we treat this as a confirmed anomaly. New protocol. All inventory counts will be witnessed by 2 people and logged immediately. No one enters the south module lockers alone. If you need supplies, request them through me or Torres." He dismissed us. I went to Lab 1 and tried to focus on my work. At 0900, I heard raised voices from the hub. I walked to the doorway and listened. Torres was saying, "Couldn't have disappeared. The seal was intact." Petrov said, "I know." "But it did," Torres said. "Then someone broke the seal and resealed it." Yates said, "Why? Why would anyone do that?" There was a long silence. Then Petrov said, "We follow the protocols. We document everything. We don't speculate." At 1300, I was back in the observation module with Shen. The surface communication window came and went. Petrov reported the inventory discrepancy to Surface Command. The response was brief. "Continue monitoring. Document any additional anomalies. Maintain all safety protocols." At 1421, I saw the pale shape again. It was at the east porthole, moving slowly downward. I logged it. Shen watched the thermal display. She said, "Still no heat signature." I said, "Have you ever identified what it is?" She said, "No. We've sent video to Surface. They haven't identified it either." I said, "Could it be a submarine? Something from another facility?" She said, "There are no other facilities within 50 kilometers, and it doesn't move like any submarine I've seen." The shape disappeared. We continued the shift in silence. At 2100, I joined Conrad for evening inventory. We walked to the south module together, neither of us alone. Petrov unlocked the lockers and watched as we counted. Oxygen, 24. Batteries, 36. Rations, 47. The count was stable. I felt a small relief. At 22:36, I lay in my bunk and read the protocol card again. I paid special attention to Protocol 3. Do not respond to any voice or knock between 0100 and 0400. I thought about the voice I'd heard my first night. It had sounded exactly like Petrov. The cadence, the tone, even the specific phrasing. But Petrov would have known the protocol. He would never have knocked during the restricted hours. I set my alarm for 0530 and turned off the light. At 0147, I woke to knocking again. 3 slow knocks. I checked my watch. I stayed in the bunk. A voice said, "Dr. Marsh, it's Yates. I need to talk to you. It's important." I didn't respond. The voice said, "I know you're awake. I can see your light was on a minute ago." My light had been off for over 2 hours. The voice said, "Please open the door. Something's happened to Petrov. I need your help." I pressed my hands over my ears and counted to 200. When I stopped counting, the corridor was silent. At 0406, I checked the door monitor. The screen was black, just like before. I waited until 0500, then got up and dressed. At 0545, I went to the hub to check the new door codes. Petrov was sitting at the table. He was drinking coffee and reading a tablet. He looked completely normal. I said, "Good morning." He said, "Morning. Sleep well?" I said, "Fine." I memorized my new code, 8361. I went back to my quarters, then met Conrad at 0600 for inventory. The counts were stable. Oxygen 24, batteries 36, rations 47. At 0700, I ate breakfast with Yates and Shen. Yates seemed tired, but otherwise normal. She didn't mention coming to my door. I didn't ask. My third day at Tethys Station followed the same pattern: lab work, observation shift, inventory, restricted hours. The pale shape circled the station twice during my observation shift. I logged both sightings. The ration count remained at 47. On the fourth day, the count dropped to 46. Petrov called another meeting. He said, 2 rations missing now. The pattern suggests systematic removal. Either someone is breaking protocol, or we have a contamination issue with the logging system, Torres said. The logging system is fine. I've checked it 3 times, Petrov said. Then we're missing food, and no one is admitting to taking it. Shen said, "What if it's not one of us?" Everyone looked at her. Petrov said, "There are 6 people on this station. 6 people and no one else." Shen said, "Are we certain?" Conrad said, "I've been doing head counts. 6 people, every shift." Yates said, "Maybe we should check the docking module, see if there's any sign of breach." Petrov said, "The docking module is sealed. The pressure sensors would alert us to any breach." Torres said, "Unless something came in during a supply transfer." Petrov said, "The last supply transfer was 9 days ago, before Dr. Marsh arrived. If something came in then, we would have noticed by now." I said, "What about the moon pool?" Everyone turned to look at me. I said, "Protocol 7 says the moon pool is off limits, except during scheduled dive operations. And it says not to investigate if we hear water movement outside of dive operations. That implies something could access the moon pool." Petrov said, "The moon pool is a controlled access point. The entrance is at 98 meters depth. Nothing larger than a small shark could navigate the access tunnel." Yates said, "And the inner hatch is sealed." I said, "When's the last time someone verified the seal?" Torres said, "I check it every 3 days. Last check was yesterday, the 9. "Seal is intact," Petrov said. "We're going in circles. Here's the new protocol. Inventory checks will now occur 3 times daily. 0700, 1400, and 2100. All personnel will remain in the hub during the restricted hours unless on documented maintenance duty. No exceptions." He dismissed us. I went to my quarters and tried to rest. At 1300, the communication window opened. I could hear Petrov's report from my room. 2 missing ration packs, no explanation, crew morale stable, requesting guidance. Surface Command's response was muffled, but I caught fragments. Continue protocols. Do not attempt evacuation unless. Monitor for additional anomalies. At 1400, I began my observation shift. Conrad joined me. The pale shape appeared 4 times during the shift, twice at the north porthole, once at the east, once at the west. Each sighting lasted between 9 and 16 seconds. The pattern was consistent, slow movement, no heat signature, smooth reflective surface. At 1543, something new happened. The shape appeared at the center porthole and stopped. It didn't pass by. It stayed there, 8 meters out, suspended in the water. I logged it. 1543, center porthole, pale shape stationary, 8 meters estimated distance. Conrad stood and walked to the porthole. He stared at the shape. I joined him. Up close, I could see more details. The surface was perfectly smooth, like polished metal or glass. The dark stripe I'd seen before was actually a seam, running horizontally along what might have been the upper third of the body. There were no fins, no eyes, no visible means of propulsion. Conrad said, "It's watching us." I said, "How can you tell?" He said, "Look at the seam. It's oriented toward the porthole, toward us." I looked. He was right. The seam was facing directly at the porthole, like a slit pupil or a viewing aperture. The shape stayed for 3 minutes and 14 seconds. Then it rotated slowly and descended out of view. I logged it all. At 2100, we did the 3rd inventory of the day. The ration count was 45. Another pack gone. Petrov didn't call a meeting this time. He just updated the log and told everyone to follow the protocols. That night, at 0132, I heard knocking at my door. This time, it was 3 quick knocks followed by 2 slow knocks. I stayed in the bunk. A voice said, "Dr. Marsh, this is Torres. I need you to let me in. I'm being followed." I checked my watch. 0132. Restricted hours. The voice said, "Please, it's right behind me. I can hear it breathing." I didn't move. The voice said, "I'm going to die out here. Please open the door." I counted to 300. The knocking stopped at 147. The voice continued until 208. Then, silence. At 0400, I got up and checked the door monitor. Black screen. I waited until 0500, then went to the hub. Torres was there, eating breakfast. He looked fine. At 0700, the ration count was 44. Petrov implemented a new security measure. He installed a camera in the south module corridor, positioned to watch the equipment locker entrance. The camera fed to a monitor in the hub. He assigned watch rotations. Someone would monitor the camera feed at all times. I took the first watch, from 0800 to 1200. I sat in the hub and watched the monitor. The corridor was empty and white and completely still. Nothing moved. At 0900, Torres walked past the camera on his way to the lockers. He was carrying a toolkit. He unlocked the locker, removed a battery pack, logged it on the tablet, and left. The entire sequence took 4 minutes. At 1127, something moved in the corridor. I leaned closer to the monitor. There was a shadow on the floor, cast by something outside the camera's viewing angle. The shadow moved slowly from left to right, then stopped. I radioed Petrov. "There's movement in the south corridor. I can see a shadow," Petrov said. "Who's on duty in that module?" I checked the schedule. No one. Shen is in Lab 1. Everyone else is in the hub or their quarters, Petrov said. "Stay on the monitor. I'm going to check it." 2 minutes later, Petrov appeared on the monitor. He walked into the frame, looked both ways, and knelt to examine the floor. He stood and looked directly at the camera, then shook his head. He radioed me. "Nothing here. Floor is clean. No footprints, no water, no debris." I said, "I saw a shadow. It was definitely there." He said, "I believe you, but there's nothing here now." He left the frame. The corridor was empty again. At 1400, the inventory count was 44, stable, no new disappearances. At 1400, I began my observation shift with Yates. The pale shape appeared once, at 1612, at the south porthole. It moved past in 11 seconds and didn't return. At 1900, Petrov reported to Surface Command. He described the missing rations, the shadow in the corridor, the continued sightings of the pale shape. Surface Command's response was longer this time. I listened from the observation module. The woman's voice said, "Tethys, we've consulted with the behavioral analysis team. Their recommendation is to continue current protocols. Do not attempt to identify or interact with any anomalous phenomena. Maintain strict adherence to the restricted hours protocol. We're scheduling an early supply transfer. Arrival in 72 hours. Can you maintain until then?" Petrov said. "Affirmative. Crew is stable. Supplies are sufficient." The woman said, "Understood. If the situation deteriorates, initiate emergency evacuation per manual section 7. Next check-in at 0800 tomorrow," Petrov said. "Tethys out." At 2100, the ration count was 43. Petrov called a meeting. All 6 of us sat at the table. No one spoke for a long moment. Finally, Petrov said, "We have a serious problem. We're losing 1 ration pack per day, sometimes 2. At this rate, we'll be at critical supply levels in 9 days. The transfer arrives in 3 days. We need to secure the lockers," Torres said. "They're already secured. The camera shows no one entering without logging it," Yates said. "Then, something is bypassing the camera," Shen said. "Or something is taking the rations before we count them," Conrad said. "That doesn't make sense. We count 3 times a day now," I said. "What if someone is taking them during the restricted hours?" Everyone looked at me. I said, "Between 0100 and 0400, when no one is monitoring," Petrov said. "Protocol requires everyone to remain in their quarters during those hours." I said, "What if someone isn't following the protocol?" Torres said. "Then they're putting all of us at risk," Petrov said. "I'll review the camera footage from the past 3 nights. If someone is moving during restricted hours, we'll know." The meeting ended. I went to my quarters and tried to sleep. At 0155, the knocking started again. This time it wasn't at my door. It was at the porthole. 3 slow knocks, metal on glass. I sat up and looked. The porthole was dark. I couldn't see anything beyond the glass. The knocking continued. 3 slow knocks. Pause. 3 slow knocks. I stayed in the bunk and pulled the blanket over my head. The knocking continued for 14 minutes. I counted each sequence. 23 sequences total. Then it stopped. At 0400, I checked the porthole. The water looked normal. The exterior lights were back to their orange glow. At 0700, the ration count was 42. Petrov reviewed the camera footage. He called another meeting at 0800. He said, "I've reviewed the past 3 nights. The south corridor camera shows no movement during restricted hours. No one entered the corridor. No one accessed the lockers," Yates said. "Then how are the rations disappearing?" Petrov said, "I don't know, but I'm implementing additional security. Torres, you'll install a second camera facing directly at the locker doors. Shen, you'll help me install pressure sensors on the locker hatches. If anyone or anything opens those doors, we'll know immediately." The work took most of the day. At 1400, I started my observation shift alone. Conrad was helping with the sensor installation. The pale shape appeared twice during my shift, once at the west porthole, once at the north. Both sightings were brief, less than 10 seconds each. At 1903, while I was logging the second sighting, the pressure alarm sounded. The alarm was a high-pitched pulse that echoed through the entire station. I dropped the tablet and ran to the hub. Petrov was already there, checking the pressure panel. He said, "South module." Pressure drop detected in the equipment locker section. Torres came running from the observation module. "How much of a drop?" Petrov said, "0.3 psi. Not critical, but definitely a breach." We all went to the south module. The corridor looked normal. The camera feeds showed nothing unusual. Petrov unlocked the equipment locker and opened the door. The room looked the same as always. Shelves of supplies, sealed containers, everything in order. Except the oxygen canisters were wrong. We counted. 22. We counted again. 22. 2 canisters were missing. Torres checked the seals on the locker door. They were intact. He checked the ventilation ducts, sealed. He checked the floor, the walls, the ceiling. Everything was secure. Petrov said, "This isn't possible. We've had sensors and cameras on this room for the past 6 hours. No one entered. Nothing opened," Yates said. Then they disappeared from inside the room. We stood there in silence. Then Petrov said, "New protocol. We're moving all critical supplies to the hub. Oxygen, emergency rations, batteries, first aid. Everything gets relocated immediately. No one enters the south module lockers unless accompanied by 2 other people." We spent the next 2 hours moving supplies. By 2100, the hub was crowded with equipment cases and containers. The inventory was simple now. Everything was visible and within arm's reach. The ration count was 42, stable for the first time in 3 days. At 2100, Petrov gathered us in the hub. He looked exhausted. He said, "Surface Command is aware of the situation. They've moved up the supply transfer to tomorrow at 10 to 100. When the transfer team arrives, we'll brief them fully. Until then, we maintain the protocols. Everyone stays in the hub, except during scheduled lab work or rest periods. No one goes to the south module alone," Shen said. "What about the restricted hours? Do we all stay in the hub?" Petrov said. "No, the protocol stands. Between 0100 and 0400, everyone stays in their quarters. The automated systems will monitor the hub," Conrad said. "That seems risky. If something happens," Petrov said, "the protocol exists for a reason. We follow it." At 2200, I went to my quarters. I locked the door and wedged my chair under the handle. I lay in the bunk with my eyes open, watching the porthole. At 0112, the lights went out. Not the scheduled lights out at 0214. All the lights. My room was completely dark. I checked my watch. The display glowed faintly. 0112. I heard something moving in the corridor. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. They stopped at my door, knocking. 3 slow knocks. A voice said, "Dr. Marsh, let me in." The voice was mine, my own voice, exact in every detail. I didn't respond. The voice said, "I know you can hear me. Let me in. I need to come inside." I pressed my hands over my ears and counted. The knocking continued. The voice continued. My voice, speaking to me from the other side of the door. At 0127, the lights came back on. The corridor was silent. I stayed in the bunk until 0500. I didn't sleep. At 0700, I went to the hub for inventory. Everyone was there, all looking as tired as I felt. We counted the supplies together. Everything was accounted for. Nothing had disappeared during the night. Petrov said, "The transfer team will be here at 10 to 100, 3 more hours." At 0800, we made contact with Surface Command. Petrov gave a brief report. No new disappearances. Crew stable. Ready for transfer. The woman's voice said, "Tethys, be advised the transfer team will include a behavioral specialist and a structural engineer. They'll conduct a full station assessment. Estimated time on station, 4 hours. Transfer window opens at 10 to 100, Petrov said. Understood. Tethys out. At 9:45, we gathered in the hub. The docking module was pressurized and ready. Petrov stood by the radio, monitoring the transfer. Team's descent. At 9:57, the radio crackled. Transfer 1 to Tethys. We're at 50 meters. ETA, 3 minutes. Petrov said, acknowledged. Docking port is clear. At 9:59, we heard the docking clamps engage. A metallic thud echoed through the station. Petrov opened the inner hatch and waited. The transfer team stepped through, 2 men in dry suits, both carrying equipment bags. The first man removed his hood. He was middle-aged, with a gray beard and calm eyes. He said, "I'm Dr. Reeves, behavioral specialist. This is Chen, structural engineer. We're here to assess the situation and resupply the station." Petrov briefed them in the hub. He described the missing supplies, the pressure anomalies, the pale shape, the voices during restricted hours. Reeves took notes on a tablet. Chen listened without expression. When Petrov finished, Reeves said, "How many crew members have experienced contact attempts during restricted hours?" Everyone raised their hands, Reeves said. And how many of you have responded or opened your doors? No one raised their hands. Reeves said, Good, that's very good. You've followed the protocols correctly, Chen said. I need to inspect the south module, specifically the equipment lockers and the moon pool access, Torres said. I'll take you. They left. The rest of us stayed in the hub. Reeves asked questions about the daily routines, the observation schedules, the inventory procedures. He was particularly interested in the timing of the lights-out period. He said, The 0214 to 0226 window. Have you noticed any patterns during that time? Sounds, movements, pressure changes? Yates said, It's always quiet, like the station is holding its breath. Reeves said, That's an apt description. The window exists because that's when the exterior phenomena are most active. By eliminating the lights, we reduce their interest in the station. I said, What are they? Reeves looked at me. He said, We don't know. We have theories. The behavioral patterns suggest intelligence, or something that mimics intelligence. They seem drawn to light, sound, and movement. They test boundaries. They adapt, but they follow rules, just like you do, Shen said. What happens if someone breaks the protocols? Reeves said. We've had 3 stations in this program. Tethys is the second. The first station had 12 crew members. 6 survived. The third station had 8 crew members. All 8 survived. The difference was protocol adherence, Conrad said. What happened to the people who didn't survive? Reeves said. They opened doors during restricted hours. They responded to voices. They investigated anomalies. They tried to identify the phenomena. In every case, they violated the protocols designed to keep them safe. At 11:20, Chen and Torres returned. Chen was carrying a small waterproof case. He set it on the table and opened it. Inside were 3 objects, a metal cylinder about 10 centimeters long, a smooth white stone, and a piece of fabric. Chen said, I found these in the moon pool access tunnel, approximately 20 meters inside, wedged in a service duct. Petrov said, That access tunnel should be sealed. Chen said, The seal has been compromised. Not breached, but weakened. Something has been applying pressure from the outside. Regular, rhythmic pressure. The seal is rated for another 6 months, maybe less. Reeves picked up the metal cylinder. He said, This is an emergency oxygen canister, Mark 7 model, same as what you use on the station. He picked up the fabric. It was torn and stained. He said, This is from a standard issue jumpsuit. The name tag is still partially visible. I can make out Watt, probably Watson or Waters. Yates said, Doctor, Waters was on the previous crew. She disappeared 8 months ago. Reeves set the fabric down carefully. He said, The stone is the most interesting item. It's not native to this region. The composition suggests it came from much deeper water. Below 300 meters. He paused. Then he said, Something brought these items into the station, or tried to. There was a long silence. Finally, Petrov said, What do we do? Reeves said, You continue the protocols. Chen will reinforce the moon pool seal. I'll update the behavioral guidelines, and we'll increase the supply transfer frequency to every 30 days instead of 90. He stood and removed a folder from his equipment bag. He handed it to Petrov. He said, These are the amended protocols, effective immediately. Review them with your crew and post them in the hub. Petrov opened the folder and read. His expression didn't change, but I saw his hands tighten on the papers. The amended protocols were more restrictive than the original 14 rules. There were 20 rules now, and several of the original rules had been modified. Reeves and Chen spent the next 2 hours resupplying the station and reinforcing the moon pool seal. At 13:40, they prepared to leave. Reeves shook Petrov's hand. He said, You've done well. Your crew is disciplined. That's the most important factor. Maintain the protocols and you'll complete your rotation safely. The transfer team entered the docking module, the hatches sealed. We heard the clamps release and the external winch engage. Then they were gone. Petrov gathered us in the hub. He posted the amended protocols on the board and gave each of us a copy. He said, Read these carefully. Some changes are minor, some are significant. We start following them immediately. I read the new protocols. Tethys Station Operational Protocols, Amended 1. All exterior hatches must remain sealed between 2200 and 0600. This includes the moon pool access, wet room, and docking module. No exceptions. Previously 2200 to 0600, now enforced strictly 2. Observation module occupancy is limited to 2 personnel at any time. If you enter and find 2 people already present, leave immediately and wait in the hub. Count the people carefully. Verify their name badges before assuming they are crew. Addition: Name badge verification 3. Do not respond to any voice or knock at your quarters door between 0100 and 0400. Verify identity through the door monitor before opening at any other time. Do not open the door if the monitor shows a black screen. Addition: Black screen clause 4. If you see another crew member in a corridor without their name badge, do not acknowledge them. Return to the hub and report to the station lead. If the person follows you, do not look back. Do not run. Walk at normal pace. Addition: Behavior Instructions 5. All exterior lights must be turned off between 0214 and 0226 each night. The timer is automatic. Do not override it. During this period, remain in your quarters or the hub. Do not move through corridors. Do not use flashlights or personal. Addition: Movement and light restrictions 6. Communication with the surface is restricted to scheduled windows 0800, 1300, and 1900. Emergency frequency is channel 9. Use only in documented emergencies. Do not attempt communication during the blackout window 0214 to 0226. Addition: Blackout restriction 7. The moon pool is off limits except during scheduled dive operations. If you hear water movement from the moon pool outside of dive operations, do not investigate. Report to the station lead. Do not approach the moon pool access hatch. Maintain a minimum distance of 3 meters. Addition: Distance restriction 8. Do not enter Lab 2 if the red pressure light above the door is active, even if you hear someone inside calling for help. Addition: Calling for help clause 9. Inventory checks occur at 0700, 1400, and 2100 daily. Count all oxygen canisters, battery packs, and emergency rations. Record discrepancies immediately. All critical supplies are now stored in the hub. Do not retrieve items from the south module lockers without authorization. Modification: Hub storage 10. If the external hull pressure alarm sounds, proceed to your designated safe room and seal the hatch. Do not exit until the all clear is given by the station lead or by surface command via radio. If you hear knocking on your safe room door during an alarm, do not open it. Addition: Knocking clause 11. The west corridor porthole must remain covered with the steel shutter between 2300 and 0500. Do not open the shutter during this period for any reason. If the shutter opens by itself, do not close it. Report to the station lead. Addition: Self-opening clause 12. Do not consume any food or water stored in the south module equipment lockers. These supplies are reserved for emergency use only and are sealed for contamination control. If you find food or water in your quarters that you did not place there, do not consume it. Report it immediately. Addition: Unexplained items clause 13. If you see lights moving outside the station that are not part of the exterior lighting array, do not attempt to identify the source. Record the time and location, then move to the hub. Do not watch the lights for more than 5 seconds. Addition: Time limit 14. All research materials and samples must be logged in the central database within 1 hour of collection. Do not store biological samples in personal quarters. If you find biological material in your quarters, do not touch it. Seal your door and report immediately. Addition: Contamination. Protocol 15. If you encounter another crew member who does not respond to verbal communication, do not touch them. Observe their name badge and report their behavior to the station lead. Maintain a minimum distance of 2 meters. New Rule 16. The south module equipment lockers are now restricted access. Only the station lead and maintenance officer may enter. If you require supplies from these lockers, submit a written request. Do not attempt to bypass the restrictions. New Rule 17. If you hear your own voice speaking from outside your quarters, do not respond. Do not open the door. Do not acknowledge the voice in any way. Wait until 0400 and report to the station lead. New Rule 18. All observation logs must include precise timestamps, distances, and duration. If you observe the pale shape, designated UP01, log it immediately. Do not attempt to photograph or video record it. Do not tap on the portholes to attract its attention. New Rule 19. If your porthole shows anything other than water and sediment during restricted hours, 0100 to 0400, cover the porthole with your blanket and do not look at it again until 0400. Report it in the morning. New Rule 20. If you are the last person to leave the hub at the start of restricted hours, verify that all hatches are sealed and all lights are dimmed. Count the number of people who went to their quarters. The count should equal 6. If the count is different, report immediately to the station lead. Do not search for missing personnel. New Rule. I read the protocols 3 times. Each new addition or modification reflected something that had happened or might happen. The system was adapting to our experiences, codifying survival into specific behaviors. Petrov said, "Questions?" Torres said, "Rule 20. What if the count is wrong? What if there are 7 people instead of 6? Petrov said, "Then one of them isn't crew. You report it immediately, and we verify." Identities. Yates said, "Rule 17. The voice that sounds like yourself. Has that happened before?" Petrov said, "Yes. On the previous crew, Dr. Waters reported hearing her own voice 3 nights before she disappeared. She violated protocol. She opened her door." Shen said, "What happened when she opened it?" Petrov said, "The report is incomplete, but the next morning, her quarters were empty. Her jumpsuit was found in the moon pool access tunnel, along with her personal effects. She was never recovered." We sat in silence for a moment. Conrad said, "How many people have we lost to this program?" Petrov said, "Across both active stations, 12 total. 10 violated protocols. 2 died during emergency evacuations due to equipment failure. No one has been lost while following the protocols correctly." I said, "What about the first station? You said 6 people survived. That means 6 didn't," Reeves said. "The first station didn't have adequate protocols. They were developed after that incident, refined after each subsequent event. The system works now, but only if everyone complies." At 1400, I began my observation shift. I was paired with Shen. We sat in silence, watching the portholes. The pale shape appeared at 1531. South porthole, distance approximately 10 meters, duration 9 seconds. I logged it. Shen said, "It's closer than yesterday." I said, "How can you tell?" She said, "I've been tracking the distance estimations. 2 weeks ago, it stayed beyond 20 meters. Last week, it was averaging 15. This week, it's coming closer. 10 meters. 8. Yesterday, it was 6. I said, "What happens when it reaches the portholes?" She said, "I don't know, but that's why we have the protocols." At 0214 that night, I lay in my bunk and watched my watch. The seconds counted down. When the display changed to 0214, the lights went out. The darkness was total. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I stayed still and listened. Footsteps in the corridor, slow and rhythmic. They passed my door and continued toward the hub. I counted the footsteps, 23, before they faded out of hearing. Then I heard something at my porthole. Not knocking, breathing. A slow, steady rhythm, like someone standing just outside the glass. The breathing continued for the entire 12 minutes of the blackout window. At 0226, the lights came back on. I looked at the porthole, just water and the orange glow of the exterior lights. At 0700, the inventory count was stable, all supplies accounted for. Petrov looked relieved. The next few days settled into a tense routine. Lab work, observation shifts, inventory checks, restricted hours. The pale shape appeared regularly during observation shifts, sometimes once per shift, sometimes 3 or 4 times, always closer. Shen's tracking was accurate. By the 8th day after the amended protocols, the shape was consistently within 5 meters of the portholes. The voices during restricted hours continued. Each night, I heard knocking and voices. Sometimes it was my voice. Sometimes it was someone else from the crew. Once it was my mother's voice, asking me to let her in from the cold. I didn't respond. I counted and waited for 0400. On the 12th day, something changed. I was on observation shift with Torres. It was 1642. The pale shape appeared at the center porthole, 3 meters away, the closest it had ever been. For the first time, I could see details. The surface wasn't smooth. It was covered in tiny, regular patterns, like scales or tiles, each one no larger than a coin. The seam I'd noticed before was more complex up close. It ran horizontally but had branches that split off at perfect 90-degree angles. The branches formed a grid pattern across the upper surface. Torres said, "Those look like access panels." I said, "For what?" He said, "I don't know, but that's engineered. That's not biological." The shape stayed for 4 minutes, then slowly descended out of view. At 1900, Petrov reported the sighting to Surface Command. He described the details we'd observed. There was a long pause before the woman's voice responded. She said, "Tethys, maintain all current protocols. Do not attempt any interaction with UPO-1. We're sending a specialized team for assessment. ETA 72 hours, Petrov said. "Understood. Any specific instructions for the interim?" The woman said, "Yes. New temporary protocol. If UPO-1 makes contact with the station hull, evacuate to the hub immediately and seal all module hatches. Do not remain in peripheral modules. We'll send detailed instructions in tomorrow's communication window," Petrov said. Acknowledged. Tethys out. That night, at 0136, something knocked on the station hull, not at a porthole, on the hull itself. 3 slow knocks, deep and resonant. The sound echoed through the entire structure. I got out of bed and stood in the center of my quarters, away from the walls. The knocking continued. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 knocks. It was making a circuit around the station. I could hear it moving. East side, south side, west side, north side, back to east. The circuit took 7 minutes. Then it repeated. 5 complete circuits before 0400. At 0700, Petrov gathered everyone in the hub. We all looked exhausted. He said, "Everyone heard the knocking." We all nodded. He said, "Torres, I need you to do a complete hull integrity check. All modules, all seals. I want measurements, pressure readings, anything that shows change or stress," Torres said. "It'll take most of the day." Petrov said, "Then start now." Torres left. Petrov turned to the rest of us. He said, "New interim protocol. Between now and the specialist team's arrival, everyone stays in the hub between 2200 and 0600. We'll set up sleeping arrangements. No one sleeps in their quarters. No one is alone in a peripheral module," Yates said. "What about the restricted hours protocol? We're supposed to stay in our quarters," Petrov said. "The protocols are adapting. This takes priority. We stay together." We spent the day setting up the hub for sleeping. We brought mattresses from the quarters and arranged them on the floor. We moved personal items, toiletries, changes of clothes. By 2000, the hub looked like a camp dormitory. At 2100, we did. Inventory. Everything was stable. We ate a late dinner together, freeze-dried stew and protein bars. No one talked much. At 2153, Torres returned from the hull integrity check. He looked shaken. Petrov said, "Report." Torres said, 37 points of stress on the outer hull, all in a pattern. They're evenly spaced, approximately 2 meters apart, running in 3 complete rings around the station. The stress points show repeated impact. "Something has been testing the hull systematically," Petrov said. "Is the integrity compromised?" Torres said. "Not yet, but if the impacts continue and increase in force, we could have microfractures within 2 weeks, full breach within 4. Shen said, "How long until the specialist team arrives?" Petrov checked his notes. 60 hours, Conrad said. "We need to evacuate." Petrov said, "Evacuation is last resort." The procedure is dangerous and destructive. We wait for the specialists, Yates said. And if the hull is breached before they arrive, Petrov said, then we evacuate. At 2200, we all settled in the hub. The lights dimmed to night mode. 6 of us on mattresses arranged in a circle, all facing the center. Petrov had assigned a watch rotation, 2 people awake at all times, monitoring the hatches and the radio. I took first watch with Yates. We sat at the table, drinking coffee from insulated mugs. The station was quiet. At 2312, the west corridor porthole shutter began to rattle. Yates said, "It's trying to open it." I said, "Protocol 11. If it opens by itself, we don't close it." She said, "I know the protocol." The rattling continued for 8 minutes, then stopped. The shutter stayed closed. At 0100, the restricted hours began. We both stayed awake and alert. At 0118, we heard knocking. It was coming from everywhere at once. The north hatch, the south hatch, the east hatch, the west hatch. All 4 hatches, knocking in unison. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. Petrov sat up on his mattress. He put a finger to his lips. We stayed silent. Then the voices started. 1 voice at each hatch. The north hatch voice was Torres. The south hatch voice was Conrad. The east hatch voice was Shen. The west hatch voice was mine. 4 versions of our crew, speaking from outside the hub, asking to be let in. Petrov, it's Torres. I'm locked out. Open the hatch. Dr. Yates, please open the door. It's Conrad. I need help. Is anyone there? This is Dr. Shen. I can't get my door open. Hello? This is Dr. Marsh. I'm in the corridor. Let me in. Petrov stood and did a head count. 6 people in the hub, all accounted for. He made eye contact with each of us and held up 6 fingers. The voices continued for 11 minutes. Then they stopped. The station was silent. At 0214, the lights went out. The hub was pitch black. I heard breathing all around me. The 5 other people in the room, all awake now, all silent. And something else, breathing outside the hatches, slow and steady, at all 4 access points simultaneously. At 0226, the lights came back on. We were all sitting up, staring at the hatches. The breathing outside had stopped. At 0400, restricted hours ended. No one went back to sleep. We made coffee and sat at the table, waiting for dawn that wouldn't come at 112 meters below the surface. At 0800, Petrov made contact with Surface Command. He reported the hull stress points, the simultaneous knocking, the mimicry of all 4 crew voices at once. The woman's voice was tense. Tethys, the specialist team is accelerating deployment. New ETA 36 hours. In the interim, implement emergency protocol set. Do you have the emergency protocol documentation? Petrov said. Affirmative. Emergency protocols are posted, she said. Implement immediately. Full lockdown. No one enters peripheral modules. All personnel remain in the hub. Monitor hull integrity every 4 hours. If pressure drops below threshold, evacuate immediately, Petrov said. Understood, she said. Tethys, I need to be clear about something. The phenomena you're experiencing represent a significant escalation. Previous stations have not reported simultaneous multi-point contact. You need to maintain absolute protocol compliance, no exceptions. Do you understand? Petrov said. We understand. Tethys out. He turned to us. He said, we're in full lockdown. No one leaves the hub except for critical maintenance. Torres, you'll do hourly visual checks of the hub systems, but you don't leave this room. Everyone else, we wait. The emergency protocols were simpler than the regular protocols. Only 5 rules, but each one was critical. Tethys, Station Emergency Protocols 1. All personnel must remain in the central hub. No access to peripheral modules except by direct order from station lead in a documented emergency. 2. Hull integrity checks occur every 4 hours. If pressure drop exceeds 0.5 psi, initiate evacuation protocol immediately. 2. 3. During restricted hours, 0100 to 0400, all personnel remain awake and silent. No responses to external sounds or voices. No investigation of anomalies. 4. Emergency communication with surface occurs every 4 hours on Channel 9. Maintain contact discipline. Report only facts, no speculation. 5. If evacuation is initiated, all personnel proceed to the docking module in order: station lead, maintenance officer, senior researchers, junior researchers. Ascent time is 18 minutes. Stay sealed in the capsule until surface recovery confirms safe atmosphere. We settled into the emergency routine. Torres monitored the hub systems. The rest of us tried to work, reviewing data, writing reports, reading, but mostly we waited. At 1200, Torres did the first hull integrity check. He used the remote monitoring system, checking pressure sensors throughout the station. The readings showed continued stress, but no breach. At 1400, the stress points had increased to 41. At 1600, Petrov made emergency contact with surface. He reported the increasing stress points. The woman's voice said the specialist team was en route, ETA 22 hours. At 1800, Torres reported 53 stress points. The pattern was expanding. Whatever was testing the hull was becoming more systematic. At 2000, we ate dinner in silence. Freeze-dried chicken and rice, protein bars, water. No one had much appetite. At 2100, we attempted an inventory check. All supplies were in the hub, visible and accounted for. Nothing had disappeared. That was something. At 2147, the first loud impact hit the hull. It was like a hammer striking metal. Everyone jumped. Torres checked the pressure sensors. No breach, but the impact had registered on 3 separate sensors: south module, outer hull, depth 112 meters. Petrov said, "Log it, time, location, sensor readings." At 2200, we dimmed the lights and prepared for the night. No one bothered with mattresses now. We stayed at the table, all 6 of us, watching the hatches. At 2234, another impact, west side, outer hull. At 2308, another impact, north side. At 2341, another impact, east side. It was circling us again, striking the hull at precise intervals. 1 impact every 25 to 35 minutes. At 0100, restricted hours began. We all stayed awake and alert. At 0103, the knocking started. All 4 hatches simultaneously. 3 slow knocks, pause, 3 slow knocks. The pattern continued for 19 minutes, then the voices. This time they were different. They weren't mimicking our crew. They were mimicking people from our lives outside the station. The North Hatch voice was my father, who had been dead for 6 years. "Son, let me in. I've been waiting so long. Please open the door." I looked at Petrov. He shook his head firmly. "Don't respond." The South Hatch voice was Torres's daughter. He'd shown me pictures of her during a meal. She was 7 years old. "Daddy, I'm scared. Please help me. Why won't you open the door?" Torres closed his eyes. His hands were shaking. The East Hatch voice was Yates's husband. I'd heard her mention him during lab work. "Carol, it's freezing out here. I don't understand why you won't let me in. Did I do something wrong?" Yates was crying silently. The West Hatch voice was Shen's sister. I'd heard them talk on the radio during a communication window 2 weeks ago. "May, please. I don't want to be alone. Let me in. We can talk like we used to." Shen was staring at the table, her hands clenched. Petrov stood and walked around the table. He made eye contact with each of us. He mouthed the words, "Not real. Protocol 3. Don't respond." The voices continued for 27 minutes. Then they stopped. At 0214, the lights went out. In the darkness, I could hear everyone breathing. 6 people in the hub, all terrified, all trying to stay silent. And something else. Movement outside all 4 hatches. Not footsteps. Something dragging or sliding against the metal. A wet, heavy sound that made my skin crawl. The sound continued for the full 12 minutes of the blackout. At 0226, the lights came back on. We were all still there, all accounted for. But the hub felt different somehow, smaller. The walls seemed closer. At 0400, restricted hours ended. Petrov made immediate contact with Surface Command. He described the night, the voices of family members, the dragging sounds, the psychological pressure. The woman's voice was strained. "Tethys, the specialist team is 12 hours out. You need to hold until then. I'm authorizing a protocol modification. During restricted hours, you may use noise-canceling headphones if available. Block out external sounds. Focus on your crew. You're doing everything right," Petrov said. "Understood." "Requesting psychological support resources," she said. "I'm putting you through to Dr. Reeves." "Stand by." Reeves's voice came through. "Tethys, this is Reeves. I want you to understand what's happening. The phenomena are adaptive. They learn what affects you most and use it. The voices are based on fragments, radio conversations, personal effects, psychological profiles. They're not your family members. They're not real. They're probes, testing for weakness." Petrov said. "How do we resist?" Reeves said. "You're already resisting. You haven't responded. You haven't opened any hatches. You're following protocols. That's all you can do. The phenomena can't breach the protocols. They can only exploit violations." Petrov said. "What if someone breaks?" Reeves said. "Don't let them. Support each other. Remind each other that the protocols work. 12 more hours. You can do this." At 0800, Torres did another hull integrity check. 67 stress points. The pattern was now covering 80% of the station's exterior surface. We were surrounded. At 0900, we heard something new. Scratching. Long, slow scratching sounds on the hull, like metal on metal. The sound moved around the station in a deliberate pattern, north to east to south to west, then back to north. Each circuit took 11 minutes. At 0100, the scratching stopped. The station was silent for the first time in hours. At 1200, Torres reported 73 stress points. Still no breach, but the hull was being systematically weakened. At 1400, Petrov made contact with surface. The specialist team was 8 hours out. The woman's voice said they would assess the station and make a decision about evacuation. She said we were doing well. She said to hold on. At 1600, we heard singing, a woman's voice, singing an old folk song. The voice was coming from the south hatch. It was beautiful and sad and completely wrong. None of us recognized the song. The singing continued for 43 minutes, then stopped. At 1800, Torres reported 81 stress points. Petrov said we might need to evacuate before the specialist team arrived. He said we'd wait until the next hull check at 2000 to make the decision. We sat in silence, watching the clock. At 1900, Petrov tried to make contact with surface for the scheduled communication window. The radio produced only static. He tried channel 9, the emergency frequency, more static. Torres said, "We're in a communication blackout. The surface storm must have intensified." Petrov said, "Then we follow the emergency protocols. We wait for the specialist team. If hull integrity drops below threshold, we evacuate without surface confirmation." At 2000, Torres did the hull check, 94 stress points. Some sensors were showing microfractures, tiny cracks in the hull plating, not enough to cause a breach, but enough to propagate under pressure. Petrov said, "We need to prepare for evacuation. Everyone, gather your essential items. 1 bag each. We leave in the docking capsule at 2200 if the situation deteriorates further." We gathered our things, documents, personal effects, research data on waterproof drives. I packed my notebook, my father's watch, and a photograph of my family. Everything fit in a small waterproof bag. At 2100, Torres reported 97 stress points. 3 of the microfractures had expanded. We could hear water trickling somewhere in the south module. Petrov said, "That's it. We're evacuating. Docking module, now. Order per protocol. Me, Torres, Yates, Shen, Conrad, Marsh." We moved to the docking module hatch. Petrov unsealed it and opened it. The corridor beyond was dark. He turned on a flashlight and stepped through. Then he stopped. He said, "Everyone back to the hub. Now." We retreated. Petrov came back through and sealed the hatch. His face was pale. Torres said, "What did you see?" Petrov said, "The docking module is flooded. 20 centimeters of water on the floor. The pressure seal has been compromised." We all stared at him. I said, Can we repair it? Torres said. Not without surface equipment, and if the seal is breached, the module isn't safe for ascent. The capsule would flood, Petrov said. We're trapped, Yates said. There has to be another way out. The moon pool. We could surface through the moon pool, Torres said. The moon pool is 98 meters deep. We don't have the equipment for a free ascent from that depth, and the access tunnel seal is already compromised. If we open it, we could flood the entire station, Shen said. So what do? Petrov said. We hold the hub. We maintain hull integrity. We wait for the specialist team. They'll have equipment to facilitate evacuation through the moon pool or repair the docking seal, Conrad said. How long can we hold? Torres checked his monitoring tablet. He said, at the current rate of stress accumulation, we have maybe 16 hours before risk of catastrophic failure. The specialist team arrives in 6 hours. We should be okay. We returned to the hub. We sealed all 4 hatches from the inside, using the emergency locks. The hub was now our fortress. We had supplies for 4 days: oxygen, water, food. Torres confirmed the backup systems were functioning. We could survive until help arrived. At 2200, we tried the radio again. Still static. We were alone. At 2300, the impacts on the hull resumed. Harder now, louder. Each impact made the entire station shudder. I counted. 1 impact every 8 minutes, precise and methodical. At 2332, the west corridor porthole shutter opened. We heard it from the hub, the metal scraping, the latch releasing. Petrov looked at the camera feed from the west corridor. He said, the shutter is open. I can see. The porthole. There's something outside. We gathered around the monitor. The camera showed the west corridor and the porthole. Beyond the glass was the pale shape. It was directly at the porthole, no more than a meter away. The grid pattern of panels was clearly visible, and something else. One of the panels was open. Behind the panel was darkness, but I could see movement inside. Something shifting. Yates said, Is that an opening? Torres said, It looks like an access port, or an aperture. The pale shape stayed at the porthole for 9 minutes. Then it slowly moved upward out of the camera's view. At 0100, restricted hours began. This time we had noise-canceling headphones. Petrov had found 4 sets in the emergency supplies. We distributed them. Yates, Shen, Torres, and I wore them. Petrov and Conrad stayed alert without them, monitoring the cameras and sensors. At 0112, the knocking started. I couldn't hear it clearly through the headphones, but I could feel it, vibrations through the floor and walls, all 4 hatches knocking in unison. At 0127, Conrad tapped my shoulder and pointed at the north hatch. There was something under the door, a piece of paper, sliding through the gap between the hatch and the floor. Petrov walked over and picked it up. He read it, then showed it to the rest of us. It was a handwritten note on station letterhead. The handwriting was neat and precise. Dr. Marsh, I need you to open the north hatch. This is Dr. Waters. I survived. I've been in the access tunnels for 8 months. I'm injured and I can't hold on much longer. Please, you have to let me in. Petrov took out a pen and wrote on the back of the note. Not real. Dr. Waters is gone. This is a probe. Do not respond. He showed the note to everyone. We all nodded. Another piece of paper slid under the south hatch, then another under the east hatch, then another under the west hatch. 4 notes, all on station letterhead, all in the same, neat handwriting. Petrov collected them. Each note had a different message, but they all followed the same pattern. Someone claiming to be trapped, injured, desperate, begging to be let in. He crumpled the notes and put them in a trash bin. He wrote on his tablet and held it up. Don't read them. Don't respond. They're trying to find our weak points. At 0214, the lights went out. I removed my noise-canceling headphones. In the darkness, I could hear breathing all around me. The crew, trying to stay calm. And something else. Something outside the hatches, moving in the corridors. I heard footsteps, multiple sets, walking in the corridors, circling the hub. North corridor, east corridor, south corridor, west corridor. The footsteps were perfectly synchronized. At 0226, the lights came back on. We were all still there, all accounted for. but there was water on the floor near the south hatch. A small puddle, maybe a liter, clear and cold. Torres said, "That hatch is sealed. Water shouldn't be able to get through," Petrov said. "Mark it and monitor. If it increases, we have a breach." At 0400, restricted hours ended. The water puddle had not increased. Torres checked the seal on the south hatch. It was intact. He couldn't explain the water. At 0400, Petrov tried the radio again. This time we got through. The signal was weak but functional. Petrov said, "Tethys station to surface. We are in emergency lockdown in the central hub. Docking module is compromised. Requesting immediate specialist team deployment for emergency evacuation. Hull integrity at critical levels. How copy?" The woman's voice came through, broken by static. "Tethys. Copy. Specialist team. 4 hours out. Hold position. Do not attempt. Pool evacuation. Repeat. Do not. Moon pool." The signal cut out, Petrov said. 4 hours. "We can hold for 4 hours, Torres said. "Hull stress is at 106 points now. We're seeing pressure fluctuations in the south module. Microfractures are expanding," Petrov said. "Can we seal off the south module? Prevent flooding from spreading to the hub?" Torres said. "The emergency bulkhead should engage automatically if pressure drops below threshold, but I'd need to verify the system is functional," Petrov said. "Do it." Torres accessed the emergency systems through his tablet. He ran a diagnostic on the bulkhead controls. After 3 minutes, he said, "Bulkhead is functional. It'll seal automatically if the south module pressure drops more than 2 psi. But once it seals, we can't open it again without surface command override," Petrov said. "That's acceptable. We hold the hub. Everything else is secondary." At 0600, Torres reported 114 stress points. Water was now seeping under both the south and west hatches. Small puddles, a few liters each, but increasing slowly. At 0700, we attempted inventory. All supplies in the hub were accounted for. We had enough for another 3 days if necessary. At 0800, Petrov made contact with surface. The signal was clearer now. The woman's voice said the specialist team was 2 hours out. They would conduct an emergency evacuation through the moon pool using specialized equipment. We needed to hold position and not attempt anything on our own. At 0832, we heard a loud crack. The sound came from the south module. Torres checked the sensors. One of the stress points had failed completely. The hull had a small breach, approximately 3 centimeters in diameter. Water was entering the south module at a rate of 12 liters per minute. Torres said, "The bulkhead will engage in approximately 7 minutes when pressure differential hits threshold." Petrov said, "Everyone away from the south hatch. Move to the north side of the hub." We repositioned ourselves. At 0839, we heard a deep metallic sound. The emergency bulkhead, engaging. The south hatch was now sealed from the other side. The water stopped seeping under the door. Torres said, "South module is sealed. Hub integrity is stable." Petrov said, "We lost the south module, but we're secure. The specialist team will be here in 90 minutes. At 0900, another crack. This time from the west module. Torres checked the sensors. Another breach, slightly larger, approximately 5 centimeters. Water entering at 20 liters per minute. At 0906, the west module bulkhead engaged. We lost the west module." Torres said, "We've lost observation and moon pool access. Evacuation will have to be through the docking module," Petrov said. "The docking module is already compromised," Torres said. "Then the specialist team will need to effect external repairs before we can evacuate." At 0930, we heard impacts again. Harder than before. The entire station shuddered with each hit. I counted. 1 impact every 90 seconds. At 0100, Petrov made emergency contact with surface. "Tethys to surface. We have lost south and west modules to hull breach. Emergency bulkheads engaged. We are secure in the hub but cannot access moon pool or docking module. Request immediate extraction." The woman's voice. "Tethys. Specialist team is 30 minutes out. They will assess and determine extraction method. Maintain position. Do not attempt to move to peripheral modules. At 10:14, the lights flickered. Torres said, "Power fluctuation. The breaches must be affecting the electrical systems." At 10:23, another crack. East module. Breach approximately 4 centimeters. Water at 15 liters per minute. The bulkhead engaged 3 minutes later. We'd lost 3 modules. We had only the hub and the north module, our sleeping quarters. And the north module was on the other side of a sealed hatch. Torres said, "If we lose the north module, we're confined to the hub, 8 meters by 8 meters. No sleeping quarters, no showers, no privacy," Petrov said. "We'll survive. The specialist team is almost here." At 10:45, the impacts stopped. The station was silent. We waited. At 10:52, we heard something new. Voices, but not from outside the hatches, from above us, from the ceiling. Multiple voices, overlapping, speaking in different languages. I recognized English, Russian, Mandarin, Spanish. The voices were saying the same thing in each language. "Let us in. We're cold. Please help us. Let us in." The voices continued for 6 minutes, then stopped. At 1100, Petrov made contact with surface. "Tethys, we are hearing voices from above the hub, inside the superstructure. How is this possible?" The woman's voice. "Tethys, the phenomena can use acoustic channels in the structure. Do not respond to voices regardless of location. Specialist team is 10 minutes out." At 11:08, we felt the station shake. Not an impact, something different. A vibration, rhythmic and powerful, coming from below. The entire structure was resonating. Torres checked his sensors. He said, "Depth is changing. We're ascending. Slowly, but definitely ascending." Petrov said, "Is someone operating the ballast system?" Torres said, "No. All controls are here in the hub. No one's touched them. The ascent is external. Something is pushing us upward." The vibration continued. I checked my watch. 11:12. We were rising at approximately 0.5 meters per minute. At that rate, we'd reach the surface in about 4 hours. Petrov said, "Surface, this is Tethys. We are ascending uncontrolled. Something is lifting the station from below." Repeat, "Uncontrolled ascent." The woman's voice, "Tethys, specialist team is 5 minutes out. They will attempt to stabilize the station at depth. Do not initiate any emergency procedures." At 11:16, the vibration stopped. The ascent stopped. We were at 108 meters depth, 4 meters shallower than our normal position. At 11:20, we heard the specialist team's vessel dock. The sound was unmistakable, the clamps engaging, the pressure equalizing. But the docking module was flooded. They couldn't enter that way. Petrov's radio crackled. A man's voice said, "Tethys, this is Extraction Team Alpha. We're at the docking module, but it's compromised. We're moving to the moon pool. Can you access the west module?" Petrov said, "Negative. West module is sealed due to hull breach. Moon pool is inaccessible from our position." The man said, "Understood. We're going to enter through the moon pool and cut through the bulkhead. It'll take 30 minutes. Stay in the hub and maintain seal on all hatches." At 11:36, we heard cutting tools. The sound came from the west side of the hub. They were cutting through the bulkhead that sealed the west module. At 12:04, the cutting stopped. The west hatch opened from the outside. A figure in a full dive suit stepped through. He removed his helmet. It was Dr. Reeves. He said, "Everyone okay?" Petrov did a quick head count. 6 people, all present. He said, "We're intact. Shaken, but intact." Reeves said, "Good. We need to evacuate immediately. The hull is compromised in 9 locations. The station is unstable. We have a dive bell positioned at the moon pool. You'll ascend in pairs. The whole extraction will take 90 minutes. Torres said, "What lifted the station?" Reeves said, "We don't know. Our external cameras showed something large underneath, but the imagery was inconclusive. Whatever it was, it's gone now." We evacuated in pairs. Petrov and Torres went first, through the cut bulkhead, through the flooded west corridor. to the moon pool. I could hear them splashing in the water. 15 minutes later, Reeves confirmed they were in the dive bell and ascending. Yates and Shen went second. Another 15 minutes. Conrad and I went last. Reeves led us through the bulkhead cut. The west corridor was flooded to knee depth. The water was cold and smelled like metal. We waded to the moon pool chamber. The room was circular, with the pool in the center. A perfectly round opening in the floor, 10 meters across, descending into darkness. The dive bell was a cylinder suspended over the pool by cables. Reeves helped us inside. The interior was cramped, bench seating for 2, oxygen tanks, communication equipment. He sealed the hatch and radioed to the surface vessel. Extraction, Team Alpha. Final 2 passengers secured. Begin ascent. The bell detached from the moon pool rim and began to rise. Through the small porthole, I watched the station recede below us. The lights were still on in the hub and the remaining modules. The exterior looked battered, stress fractures dense, and the pale shape still circling in the distance. Conrad pointed. He said, "It's still here." I looked. The pale shape was ascending with us, keeping pace. It stayed 15 meters away, moving in a slow spiral around the dive bell. At 50 meters depth, it stopped. It hovered there for a moment, then slowly descended back toward the station. I watched until it disappeared into the darkness. At 30 meters, we felt the dive bell connect to the surface vessel's deployment system. At 10 meters, we saw sunlight filtering through the water, gray and diffused, but sunlight nonetheless. At the surface, they opened the bell and helped us onto the deck of the vessel. The Pacific was rough, 3-meter swells under a stormy sky. The air was cold and wet and felt like freedom. Petrov, Torres, Yates, and Shen were already on deck, wrapped in thermal blankets. A medic checked us over. Blood pressure, oxygen saturation, core temperature, everyone was stable. Dr. Reeves stood at the rail, looking at the water. I walked over and joined him. I said, "What happens to the station?" He said, "We'll attempt a recovery, but given the damage and the instability, we might have to abandon it. The data is what matters. And the crew, you all survived." I said, "We followed the protocols." He said, "You did. That's why you're here." I said, "What was that thing, the pale shape?" He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "We don't know. We have theories, but no conclusions. It appears at multiple deep-sea facilities. Always the same behavioral pattern. Testing, mimicry, escalation. It's curious about us. Or maybe it's trying to communicate. We don't know," I said. "It could have breached the station whenever it wanted, but it didn't. It just tested us," he said. "Yes, it follows its own rules. And as long as we follow ours, we survive." The vessel carried us back to Port Angeles. The journey took 6 hours. We spent the time in debriefing, individual interviews, psychological assessments, medical follow-ups. They asked us to describe every detail of our experience. They recorded everything. On the final evening, before we dispersed to our separate lives, Petrov gathered the 6 of us in a conference room. He had printed copies of a document, operational protocols for the next crew. He said, "They're sending a new team to Tethys in 3 months. After repairs, I've been asked to prepare the briefing materials. These protocols are what we learned, what we survived." He handed each of us a copy. I read through the rules. They were familiar. Our 20 amended protocols, plus 12 new ones derived from our experiences. There were specific instructions about the flooding sequences, the voice patterns, the physical manifestations. At the end of the document was a note written by Petrov. "To the next crew at Tethys Station. These protocols were developed through observation, experience, and loss. Every rule represents a boundary that must not be crossed. You will hear voices of people you love. You will see things that test your understanding of reality. You will be tempted to investigate, to help, to respond. Do not follow the protocols exactly. Trust your crew. Count heads every shift. Stay together during the restricted hours. And remember, the phenomena follow rules just as you do. Respect those rules, and you will complete your rotation safely. If you break the protocols, you may not survive. If you follow them completely, you will. The choice is yours. Below the note were our 6 signatures confirming that we had reviewed and approved the protocols for the next crew. I signed last, Dr. E. Marsh, marine biologist, Tethys Station, rotation 7. 3 months later, I received an email from the program coordinator. The repairs were complete. The new crew had arrived at Tethys. They had received the updated protocols. They were beginning their rotation. I thought about them down there in the darkness, 112 meters below the surface. I thought about the voices they would hear, the things they would see, the choices they would face. I hoped they would follow the protocols. I hoped they would survive. I never went back to Tethys Station, but sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I can still hear the knocking. 3 slow knocks, pause, 3 slow knocks, and a voice that sounds exactly like mine, asking to be let in from the cold. I don't answer. I never will. The protocols work. They always have. You just have to follow them.